There's a familiar feeling creeping across the world. That everything is falling apart. Wars are breaking out in multiple places at once. Tensions between the United States and China refuse to cool down. Europe is struggling with internal divisions. Prices keep rising. And many people are starting to feel lost. More and more, the question is being asked. Is the global order collapsing? Some in the West believe that if the United States no longer leads, if liberal democratic values are no longer the global standard, then the world will descend into chaos. A brutal arena where the strong dominate, and the rule of law gives way to the law of the jungle. That fear isn't entirely irrational. But, what if we've misunderstood what world order really means? Is it true that order only exists when the West is in charge? Or, long before Europe ever rose to global prominence, did human societies across the world already build their own forms of order? And if that's the case, then maybe the changes we see today aren't a collapse, but the beginning of a new chapter for humanity. To understand that, we need to look back. Not just a few decades, but thousands of years. We need to revisit how ancient civilizations governed themselves, how they coexisted, how they avoided conflict, and sometimes, even prospered together. Because the truth is this: world order was never a Western invention, and its future won't belong to any single power. Many of us were taught, or told so often that we started to believe it, that concepts like law, diplomacy, peace, and human rights were invented by the West. That it wasn't until ancient Greece or the European Enlightenment that humanity discovered reason and built civilized societies. But that's simply not true. Over 4,000 years ago, in Mesopotamia, today's Iraq, the Sumerians carved some of the first legal codes in human history into stone. They weren't perfect, but they proved something crucial: that even in the earliest stages of civilization, people understood the need for rules, for resolving disputes, and for limiting power. Later, the Babylonians introduced the Code of Hammurabi, a detailed legal system covering everything from punishments to property rights, created thousands of years before any European constitution. In Africa, ancient Egypt wasn't just about pyramids. It had a complex bureaucracy, written laws, taxation policies, and even foreign treaties, like the Kadesh Treaty with the Hittites, one of the earliest surviving peace agreements ever recorded. In Persia, kings of the Achaemenid Empire, like Cyrus the Great, did not destroy local religions as they expanded their territory. On the contrary, they allowed freedom of worship and preserved the customs of conquered peoples. It was a form of tolerance that colonial Europe rarely practiced centuries later. In India, the concept of dharma, meaning moral duty, justice, and responsibility, appeared early in the Vedic scriptures. By the 3rd century BCE, Emperor Ashoka, after witnessing the horrors of war, renounced violence and turned toward ethical governance. He promoted compassion, vegetarianism, and religious tolerance. His edicts were carved into stone pillars across the Indian subcontinent, almost like a declaration of human rights before the term even existed. In China, long before Qin Shi Huang unified the empire, Chinese thinkers had already developed a wide range of political philosophies. Confucianism emphasized moral rule and filial duty. Legalism focused on strict laws and punishment. Taoism promoted harmony with nature. These schools of thought were different in principle, but all sought the same goal: a stable and just society. In other words, they all aimed to create order. Even the ancient Chinese concept of Tianxia, the world under heaven, reflected the idea of an international system. Neighboring states paid tribute to the Chinese emperor not always under coercion, but sometimes to maintain peace and mutual recognition. All of this shows one simple truth. For thousands of years, civilizations across the world have found ways to live together, create laws, balance power, and even think deeply about justice. So when someone says, the world order was invented by the West, we have to ask, what about the thousands of years of history that came before it? Do they not count? It's true that from the 16th century onward, the West rose rapidly, first Europe, then the United States. There was the Industrial Revolution, scientific breakthroughs, global exploration, colonization, and empires that stretched across continents. But here's the thing. The West didn't just dominate through weapons or technology. It also took control by telling the story of the world in a way that favored itself. They said, we brought light to a world trapped in darkness. We brought civilization to savage lands. We invented freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, universal values everyone should follow. And so, the contributions of other civilizations, from Ashoka's ethics in India, to Babylon's legal systems, to China's political thought, were gradually forgotten, dismissed as primitive, undeveloped, or simply irrelevant. But the real history is far more complex. European empires once built their wealth by selling Africans into slavery. Profit made from the bodies and lives of other human beings. They divided up Asia and Africa with rulers and maps, ignoring local cultures, ethnic identities, and livelihoods. They seized natural resources, crushed independence movements, and imposed systems of racial hierarchy that lasted for generations, all under the banner of civilizing the world. Even in the 20th century, while preaching human rights and international law, Western powers were still using violence to hold on to their colonies. In Algeria, in Kenya, in Vietnam, where people were dying simply to reclaim their right to exist. The United States, rising as the world's dominant power after World War II, was not immune to this contradiction. On the one hand, it was a beacon of democracy, innovation, and free speech. But on the other, it supported dictatorships, as long as they aligned with its strategic interests. It launched wars under the pretext of liberation, but left behind decades of instability. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, and, of course, in Vietnam. This doesn't mean we should dismiss everything the West has contributed. Democracy, rule of law, human rights, these are important values. And many in the West have sacrificed their lives to uphold them. But we must recognize a deeper truth. These values were not invented out of thin air by the West. And the West hasn't always lived up to the ideals it promotes. When a civilization sets the rules, declares itself the moral center, and edits history to erase others, the order it creates, no matter how stable, can never be truly just. And perhaps that's exactly why we're seeing it begin to unravel. In recent decades, we've heard a lot about the so-called liberal international order. A system where nations follow international law, cooperate through multilateral institutions, respect human rights, and promote peace and development. At the center of that system have been the United States and its Western allies. They built global institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the WTO. They led climate agreements, free trade deals, and humanitarian campaigns. But today, that system is showing cracks. The US has withdrawn from many international commitments. The European Union is fractured by migration crises, Brexit, and a wave of populism. And many countries in the global south, from Africa to Latin America to Asia, no longer believe the West acts in the interest of the world as a whole. At the same time, new powers are rising. China is expanding its global reach through the Belt and Road Initiative. India speaks boldly of a nation century. And countries in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America are forging their own regional alliances, seeking influence on their own terms. What's significant is this: these countries are no longer merely playing by the West's rules. They're writing their own, at least within their spheres of influence. For many in the West, this is a time of unease. They fear the world is sliding into chaos. But we have to ask, is this truly a collapse? Or a long overdue rebalancing? Imagine a giant dinner table. For centuries, only a handful of people sat in the seats of power, deciding the menu for everyone else. Now, those who sat at the margins, or stood outside the room altogether, are asking for a voice. Yes, it might get noisy. Yes, it might feel chaotic. But maybe, just maybe, this is the beginning of a more fair, more inclusive table. Of course, not every new power is benevolent. Not every challenge to the West is noble. China, Russia, and others have serious problems of their own. From censorship and repression to military aggression and rights violations. But if we insist on preserving a Western-dominated world order at all costs, despite its flaws and double standards, aren't we just denying the rest of the world its right to speak? Maybe the order that's shaking today was never the only kind of order that could exist. And if built thoughtfully, a multipolar world, one with many centers of influence and diverse voices, might not be a disaster at all. It might just be a fairer form of globalization. As the old world order shakes, it's only natural that the world enters a period of reorganization. But instead of hoping for a new superpower to simply replace the West, we should start imagining something entirely different. A multipolar world order. Picture the world as a cinema with multiple screens playing at once. Each region, each civilization, each major power projecting its own film. No one monopolizes the audience. No one forces the entire theater to watch a single script. In that model, there's no absolute moral center. There are many different ways to organize society, deliver justice, and resolve conflict. And those differences are no longer seen as threats, but as essential parts of a modern world. Africa might design its own development models, grounded in local realities, instead of blindly following IMF prescriptions. The Middle East might protect its religious identity, while still integrating into global systems, without having to abandon every tradition. Asia might lead in technology, education, and climate innovation, without needing to imitate everything from the West. But make no mistake, multipolarity does not mean lawlessness. A world with many power centers but no shared principles can easily spiral into chaos, destructive competition, or a new kind of Cold War. That's why the world needs something more. A global civilization, not in the sense of uniformity, but in the sense of shared minimum values. Don't use force to bully smaller nations. Don't silence dissent just because it's uncomfortable. Don't sacrifice your own people just to preserve national pride. To get there, we must let go of two illusions. The first illusion is that the West will always lead. History teaches us, no empire lasts forever. The second illusion is that replacing the West with a single new superpower will solve everything. China, or any other rising power, can fall into the same trap of arrogance. If it doesn't learn to listen, to share, and to show respect. A multipolar world doesn't mean an end to conflict. But it is a world where no one gets to declare themselves the sole voice of morality and force others to follow. It's a world where every nation has a voice, and every voice must answer to humanity. That kind of world, imperfect as it may be, might just be our best chance at building a truly sustainable global order. If there's one thing we should fear in this era of change, it's not the change itself, but the misconceptions we carry about it. The belief that if the West weakens, the world will collapse. The belief that simply shifting the balance of power will fix everything. The belief that order is something handed down by the powerful, instead of something that all of humanity must build together. History shows us, order is not a gift from any one civilization. It's a negotiation, stretching across thousands of years, where people have tried, failed, suffered, and learned, in the effort to live together, share resources, and restrain ambition. And that same history reminds us, no empire is eternal. No single story is the whole truth. And no moral authority is immune to power. So if we truly want to understand the world today, we have to look back at the parts of history that were forgotten. We need to restore the voices of civilizations that were once dismissed. We need to question the so-called universal values that often serve the interests of just one side. And if we hope to help shape the future, we can't just sit back and wait for a new superpower to take over. We, ordinary people, need to equip ourselves with a clear, balanced perspective. One that doesn't blindly follow the strong, and doesn't reflexively reject the old. Understand each story, so we don't get swept up in fear. Understand each story, so we know the difference between justice and manipulation. Understand each story, so that when the world changes, we don't lose our direction. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. If you found it useful, please share it with someone, so more people can understand the world a little more clearly. And if you want to keep exploring stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.